So this panel is on electric vehicles, and electric vehicles today, if you live in Massachusetts, if I could just have the slide, and in many other places in the country and around the world, you can reduce your emissions from your personal vehicle by switching to an electric vehicle by 30% or more. That's considering today's electricity supply mix, and you could reduce those emissions even further if the electricity grid and that supply mix decarbonizes. But there are challenges remaining, and those challenges have to do with and there are also opportunities, and many of them have to do with integrating electric vehicles into the power grid. And so our panelists have a diverse set of experiences and sort of a lot of expertise in this area. And so we'll just jump right into a discussion with them. And I should say, go ahead and send your questions right away now, and I'll work them into the questions that I'm asking the panelists. Okay, so just briefly, who do we have here today? We have David Keith. He's an assistant professor of system dynamics at the Sloan School of Management here at MIT. He's worked in the automotive industry in Australia. I won't try to say that with an Australian accent, although I think I have a pretty good one we can check later. And he looks at questions of EV technology adoption, trends, supply constraints, basically what's possible, what's remaining, what's still difficult, and does some really fascinating research in this area. And then Chris Knittel is a professor, the George P. Schultz Professor of Applied Economics at MIT, does some really fascinating work as well on environmental economics, econometrics, and has been looking a lot at electric vehicles. I'm keeping these bios short so that we can turn to the discussion. But Chris serves on the as an editor for many of our most important journals, or I should say their most important journals in economics, and does some really great work. And Chelsea is working in the sort of on the ground and in the trenches, I guess, in the electric vehicle industry. She was part of the original GM, General Motors, EV1 program in the mid-1990s. And she has co-founded Plug-in America. She was featured in the documentary, some of you may have seen it, Who Killed the Electric Car? And you know, she works as an advisor and a consultant, a speaker, and collaborates with many entities in this space. I just wanted to say one thing about her bio, which I like this quote. She likes torque and horsepower more than anyone rightfully should, and tilts at windmills as a lifestyle choice. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So let me start, actually I'm going to start with a question for David. And again, please do send the questions so we can work these in. And my question for David is, what's going on in this area? What are some recent trends, and what do you see as the challenges remaining and also the opportunities?
Yeah, so the big question is sort of how quickly can electric vehicles diffuse into the on-road fleet? Because ultimately, energy consumption and emissions involves turning over the on-road fleet we have. In the United States, we have 250 million vehicles that have an average lifetime of 16 years, right? So we only turn over a small fraction of the fleet each year. And so we not only need to rapidly increase the rate of new vehicle sales, the market shares of electric vehicles in new vehicle sales, but it's going to take time to turn over that stock of vehicles on the road. So a quick sort of audit of where the world is today. Norway is the great outlier in terms of market shares. This is 2018 data, but Norway's now over 50% of new vehicle sales are electric vehicles. Iceland, you know, is along the same track. And then the majority of countries in the world are down in the 2% of new vehicle sales or lower. You know, importantly, China is such a huge market that they account for the majority of vehicles in absolute terms. However, even I think it's really important to think about how we've got to where we've got to and the role of policy. So China and Norway are great outliers in the way that incentives and taxes and other policies have been used. In China, for example, limiting the sales of license plates for gasoline vehicles, so that a lot of Chinese consumers just wanted to buy a car, and it turned out that buying an electric car was the easiest way to do that. In fact, with limits to how much we can spend on expensive electric vehicle incentives and a wavering economy, EV sales are actually dropping in China at the moment. We can emphasize this even more by looking at the history of the diffusion of these technologies in the United States. I'll draw your attention to the y-axis here, which is market shares. We've never made it over 4% of new vehicle sales, with all hybrid and electric vehicle sales combined. Hybrids grew steadily through the mid-2000s, plateaued when the economy tanked. That big drop there was actually the tsunami in Japan that interrupted Toyota's supply chain. But sales of hybrid vehicles have actually declined over the last 5 years. Now, one way that frequently people say to me, well, I can see what's going on here. We've introduced plug-in hybrid and fully electric vehicles here, and some of those buyers who might have bought a hybrid vehicle previously are now buying electric vehicles. I sort of place some weight on that, but if I overlay the price of gas, you'll see that sales of hybrid vehicles are almost perfectly correlated with the price of gas. So when what you're selling is efficient use of gasoline and the price of gasoline changes, consumers appear to be pretty rational about how they're responding. There's a big spike in the green graph there, which is sales of battery electric vehicles. That's more than 50% of the US market is the Tesla Model 3. So what I want you to take away from this is that this is not just an inexorable, decline in battery costs and an S-shaped adoption curve that blows gasoline out of the water. This is a fragile market, a product of a whole bunch of inputs: gas prices, incentives, consumer behaviour. And I think we have to continue pushing aggressively with carrot and stick to continue to build this market in the US and globally.
Okay, great. All right, we'll come back to some of these. Well, actually, let me ask you this one just quickly. David, if you have any thoughts on how we tie together new grid scale storage technologies and EV adoption.
Yeah.
I presume the idea here is to, allow EVs to act, for example, as a storage technology. They can also help with integration of renewables into the grid.
Right.
But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so EV charging is flexible demand. I mean, we have the ability to influence how people are charging and when. So we might consider this sort of managed charging, and a simple way to do that is with time of use tariffs, for example, to encourage people to charge EVs overnight. So utilities are playing a very active role in building this market, particularly on the infrastructure side. Here in Massachusetts, we have both our utilities, Eversource and National Grid, have programs to invest in EV charging. So we're really looking at, in the utility space, looking at EV charging as an alternative to building poles and wires. In Maryland, Baltimore Gas and Electric are actually subsidizing the installation of home EV chargers. However, the catch is that they're going to put you on a time of use tariff. So trying to fill out the dips in the duck curve and try and manage that peak demand. Firstly, so that we prevent EVs from making the peakiness of the grid worse, but maybe in the best case, actually increasing the utilization of the grid infrastructure.
Yeah, great. Okay, great. So Chris, you've done work on looking at costs and performance of electric vehicles and trends in both along a number of different dimensions. So if you could talk about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So I just want to make two really quick points, and some of these tied to what David was talking about a second ago. especially with respect to why market shares are so low. So the first point is the good news. This is the glass is half full story, that we've made tremendous progress in lithium-ion batteries and the cost of lithium-ion batteries. A funny story, actually, right on Thanksgiving, a group of us wrote a paper, I think in 2017, that was comparing internal combustion-based engines and electric vehicles at that time, and we were talking about battery costs being $350 a kilowatt hour. And I got an email from a mathematician at University of Minnesota on Thanksgiving saying, you're crazy. Why were battery costs, or why did you assume battery costs were $350 a kilowatt hour? And I emailed it back. I said, well, when we wrote the paper, they were. Now they're closer to $200 a kilowatt hour. If you go back just about 10 years, they were closer to $1,000 a kilowatt hour. So it looks a lot like solar costs in the sense that we've had these tremendous gains in technology and in cutting the cost of lithium-ion batteries. And that is going to be ultimately one of the key hurdles to large-scale EV adoption. This is a battery that for some vehicles is 100 kilowatt hours on board. So at $200 a kilowatt hour, that's $20,000 sitting in your trunk before you even use the car or build the car. So that's one of the big hurdles. The other hurdle would be the charging infrastructure and range anxiety. It's clear we've made enormous progress. Just to plug a recent MIT study, MIT just a couple weeks ago came out with the Mobility of the Future study under the MIT Energy Initiative. This is one of the graphs from that study that's projecting forward what battery costs are likely to look like over the next decade. And you could see that the model suggests that they're likely to asymptote about $100 a kilowatt hour, again, from the current cost of about $200. So that's great news. The bad news is if you take these numbers, or if you do the following thought experiment. Suppose you gave me your driving profile. You told me how many miles you drove, what your interest rate for buying a car is, what you think the price of oil is going to be, what the price of electricity is to charge that EV. For any given set of parameters, you could calculate what battery costs have to be for the internal combustion engine vehicle and the EV to be at cost parity. So we did that, and we've updated it since that 2017 article, but it looks something like this. And so let me just take a second to describe this a little. Maybe I'll use the pointer. So if battery costs are $200 a kilowatt hour, what this is saying is that oil has to be $200 a barrel for the internal combustion engine to cost the same over its lifetime as the EV. These are the parameters I assumed, and I have this spreadsheet. I'm happy to send it to you, and you can play around with these parameters. But this assumes you drive 15,000 miles a year. Electricity price, that's the average retail price of electricity, residential electricity in the US. The loan that you're taking to buy a car is at 5%. We could talk about the social cost of carbon in a second. How many kilowatt hours per mile does the vehicle take? Well, that's what a Tesla S takes. What are you comparing it to in terms of the internal combustion engine? I'm comparing it to a vehicle that gets 30 miles a gallon. And then the other required assumptions is how much range do you want for that EV? So I'm comparing a 250-mile range. Just realize that typical internal combustion engine range is about 400 miles. So you're already giving up something in terms of range across the two vehicles. So that with this kilowatt hours per mile, that assumes that you need a battery of 75 kilowatt hours. So what this suggests is at $200 a kilowatt hour, which we are now, we're still pretty far away. Really far away, I would say. Oil today was $58 a barrel. If you look at NYMEX futures and go out to as far out as the NYMEX futures go, the NYMEX futures saying oil is going to be $52 a barrel. So you could say, well, we're going to continue to make a lot of technological progress on batteries and so on. The other thing that I'll mention is we make technological progress on the internal combustion engine vehicles as well. I've done previous work that suggests the technology progresses in those vehicles at about 2% a year. So if you kept weight and horsepower constant, you could improve fuel economy by about 2% per year based on the gasoline-based vehicle. So we're really far away. At $100 a kilowatt hour, you need oil to be $100. Now I know the typical pushback is, but those EVs cost less to maintain. They do, and that's this graph. So again, that spreadsheet lets you play around with those numbers. But even if you think you're saving $500 a year in maintenance, you're still pretty far away. If you, again, take into account the range anxiety, the fact that we have to build out the infrastructure and so on and so forth. So the main message is we've made huge progress, but huge progress is still needed. And in addition to that, I would argue very strongly that policy is needed. I would start with the carbon tax. We can pick our favorite policy, but without aggressive policy in this space, we're going to be huddling around that 2 to 4% market share for quite a long time.
Great. So just a quick follow-up question on that. And actually, Chelsea, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on this too before I ask you a bigger question. So if we look at, and in that website I flashed up, carboncounter.com, if we look at what consumers have to pay for electric vehicles versus other kinds of cars, if you want to buy an internal combustion engine vehicle or an electric vehicle, how much more do you need to pay? And you see that there are affordable electric vehicles with range, with a range, which is an average number, but average range within, I think you looked at 250 miles there, Chris, that don't cost much more than some of the internal combustion engine vehicles. So I was just wondering, one of the questions that we have is, are companies, are car manufacturers taking a loss in selling electric vehicles? And there are some, there's people claiming that they are. The question is how much, what are the profit margins? And I was wondering if either one of you could comment on that, sort of inside the black box of car manufacturing, what's actually going on there.
Yeah, I'll comment, but I'd love to hear Chelsea's views as well. So just the basic economics tells us that at least firms operating under a fuel economy standard, if you just work out the economics of that, they're willing to sell anything better than the standard at a loss. And that might not be a technical loss. It might just be they're not making as much of a profit on electric vehicles as they otherwise would. So that's where policy comes into account. If you have an aggressive CAFE standard, firms are willing to sell EVs at a discount/loss. If you have a ZEV mandate like they do in California, which requires a certain amount of EVs, a market share of EVs within the company, then they're willing to take even a bigger loss. At one point, just to give one little data point here, under the California ZEV mandate, every Tesla S produces 7 permits, basically these things that can trade across firms, so that another firm that's not selling EVs can buy those permits off of Tesla and meet their standard. So a Tesla S produces 7 of those. At one point, those were selling at $5,000 a permit.
At one point, they were selling for 17.
Okay, so even, well, I have a new lecture note then. So that tells, that's the explicit subsidy. If you're Elon Musk selling a Tesla S and you get $17,000 times 7, what is that, 119,000? That's amazing, right? So there's your subsidy. Now we could argue over whether or not that's a great policy, which would be another 30 minutes, but at least that little data point suggests that they're willing to take a loss.
Yeah, first I must say y'all are quite intimidating. I don't teach here, I didn't go to school here, I'm not even sure how I got in the building, but thank you, and I'm sorry. The black box of automakers, and I would say the core problem that has existed, continues to exist for the last couple dozen years I've been doing this, is that the automotive industry is massively ambivalent about doing this at all. They are all simultaneously preparing to meet the policy requirements, particularly in Europe and the US. they are all also simultaneously totally happy if it takes longer than it has to. And so yes, most of them are selling at a loss. A lot of that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. They sell very few of a certain model. There's a bunch of what we have dubbed compliance cars. They're available only in the states in which they have to sell them, only the number with which they have to sell them. They don't work hard to make them terribly attractive. They don't do very much marketing. And then lo and behold, they don't sell very many, and they go to the regulators and go, gosh, we're so sorry, we tried very hard in our best Midwestern accents. Can you please water down those regulations? And that has been the cycle for 25 years. And that remains true. There are 2 to 3 manufacturers that in private conversation will admit profitability on pretty obvious high volume electrified vehicles. Publicly, they will still rock out and say, we are losing lots of money on every single one of them, have some pity on us. There is not a single automaker today that has taken the Toyota hybrid Prius approach of, yeah, we know we're going to lose money on them for a while. It's going to be a loss leader, but we see an opportunity for leadership in the space, and we are plotting our path toward it. Carlos Ghosn and Nissan tried it for a while, but they have been rolling back for the last 5 years or so. It is an open question whether U.S. automakers and the U.S. market remain significant in electric vehicles, given the EPA versus CARB fight and just how long that's dragging out. And the stagnance that's happened in the meantime and the chaos has caused a lot of automakers to dial back their plans, and especially their plans to sell them here. The LA Auto Show happened last week, and Ford won the show with the Mustang Mach-E. They're coming out with super ambitious volume numbers, 50,000 a year in year one, which is a lot, especially for an incumbent automaker. And they already plan to send 2/3 of them to Europe because they don't see need or opportunity to sell them here, which I find to be a problem.
Yeah, great. Okay. And so I guess to kind of ask the bigger question, if you could maybe add to what you already said and expand on it. I'll take a question actually from the audience and then add a little part to it myself, which is, what do you think has to be improved for electric cars before we can see wide-scale deployment? Is what this person is asking. And then just to add to that, I mean, what's happening on the ground? What should we know? What are you seeing day in and day out as you're working with these diverse stakeholders, including companies and nonprofits and consumers and researchers and so forth?
Yeah, I'm in a very fortunate position in that I get to play with everybody and represent none. So I get to be agnostic to everything but what works. For EVs to be successful, they have to be available. Our number one problem is lack of product. And by that, I mean diversity, different body styles, different performance, different prices, but also geographic availability. We have a few dozen things available in California. You go to Oklahoma and they have about 3. And people simply cannot buy what isn't available. Number 2 is lack of awareness. And especially if we set aside fleets and non-road and airport electrification and some other things that are super cool in a nerdy way, but less obvious. At the end of the day, these retail passenger car conversations, these are still cars. Cars are an emotional purchase. The average transaction price in this country is $35,000 for a car. We get super defensive about the cost of EVs, but it's not that far off. And we can debate, the capabilities of one versus another, but that's an emotional subjective assessment as well in most cases. If you bought a red car over a white one, there's still an emotional component to that purchase. And we completely lose that when we start talking about technology and electric vehicles especially. And we dumb them down to think we have to make them more familiar and not so scary and new to the consumers. And we try to sell them like an appliance. We try to sell spinach instead of ice cream. And no one waxes lyrical about their microwave. But we have known how to sell cars in this country for 100 years, and we completely forget it when it comes to electrification.
Very interesting. So we had a question here from the audience about the charging time and how these longer charging times can be shortened. I mean, we have other tools in our toolkit there to consider, which have to do with where you put charging stations and studying activity patterns, how people move around in cars, putting the charging stations where people are already stopping. And there are a lot of opportunities there that we're seeing in my research group. But I'd be curious to hear, what are your thoughts on the fast chargers that can substantially reduce charging time? What are your thoughts on charging infrastructure, what we should do about it, where we should put it? And whoever wants to answer first.
Well, I think what's interesting is Tesla has rolled out its own proprietary supercharger network, and they're running at about 140 kilowatts today. That takes about 30 to 40 minutes for a relatively full charge. So that's really too long for the average consumer who's been socialized to the idea that you refuel in 5 minutes. I think we think that if we can get that down to 15 or 20 minutes, and that's a realistic possibility, that requires the highest level chargers that are coming into the market today in Europe and with Electrify America are now operating at 350 kilowatts. That's a pretty exciting amount of power. That requires a liquid-cooled cable. We want them out on the side of the highways. But if you talk to the grid operators and you tell them that you're going to put a few megawatts of load out in the middle of nowhere on the grid, they're less excited about that idea. So I think there's sort of understanding why people are charging and where they're charging is really important. I think it's sort of almost a precondition of EV adoption that you have off-street parking at home. We know that about 90% of charging happens at home. So I think that really understanding the use cases is really important, because if I start the day with 200 or more miles of charge in my BEV because I charge it at home, I probably don't need to charge it during the day to get to work and get home. So for those types of people, then the additional thing I need is probably that fast charging out on the side of the highway. For other people, people who rent, people who live in condos, having residential charging opportunities is going to be something that we're going to need to figure out as a society.
I agree a little bit and disagree a lot. All speeds are useful in the right place. Any speed is catastrophic in the wrong place. And this focus on faster is always better and more of it is always better is going to lead to a lot of stranded assets. And super fast charging is lovely. It's also on the order of $1 a kilowatt hour. And in a 100 kilowatt hour Tesla, do that math. So it's not the common use case. The occasional road trip, sure. Tesla has already acknowledged and proven that their supercharging network is largely a marketing tactic. It is to solve a psychological problem, not a pragmatic one. But we still do want the just in case, what if I want to drive to Vegas or cross country or whatever? That question has existed forever. And that has to happen, that sprinkling. But at the same time, I would argue that on a day-to-day basis, if charging is a captive audience activity, we are doing something really wrong. Most of the time, charging your car should be similar to charging your phone. You plug it in, you walk away, you do something else. But you're not standing there watching it charge as a captive audience activity. It's not the same as filling a gasoline tank. So very, very rarely should that be the scenario, in which case it's not so much about getting 48 minutes into 20 minutes, it's putting it the right speed in the right place so that you can go off and do that something else, which is usually lower cost of capital and certainly massively lower CapEx.
Can I try to link the two?
Yeah, and I have another question.
I don't disagree with any of that. So
I don't know why
I have another question specifically.
Well, I just want to link it to a previous question, which was, can we use these storage devices on the grid? And an interesting thing, if you think about a world where we're at 100% renewables, probably a big chunk of that is solar. The solar's shining in during the day, so you actually want to charge these things during the day and not at night. From that perspective, the strategic charging locations are likely to be places at work or places where people are during the day. And I think we need to keep that in mind. So before we start putting in a bunch of very expensive level 2, level 3 charging stations at home or so on, let's think about this and David's in the system dynamics group, but from a systems perspective, that tells us a lot about when we might want people to be charging and also where the chargers should obviously be.
And
Great,
to add to that, our chargers here at MIT, the peak load is at 9:15 in the morning, right? Because everyone comes to work, plugs in, they need an hour and a half's charge, and then they're done. So.
Great. Okay, good. So 2 really quick questions, I promise, Paul. How many of you own an EV? Interesting. How many of you are thinking about buying an EV if you don't already own one?
And now let me teach you about selection.
So yeah, selection bias, but this is great. I mean, it's great to hear from all of you, and your questions are very interesting as well. So really, really, really quick, What carbon tax do we need, Chris?
Well,
A number.
there is an optimal carbon tax.
What's that?
Well, it's hard to calculate, but
So,
but the federal government does have a carbon tax on the bill. At least they did up till 2016, and that was at $42 a ton. And that comes from the modeling that suggests you release a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere, it does $43 worth of damage. So I would certainly start there. And I don't own an EV, but my license plate is tax CO2. So.
great. So I just want to mention mass transit, very important. We don't have time to talk about it, but this is just one tool in the toolkit for decarbonizing transportation. There are many other tools that we need to look at, and now we'll transition over to the final panel. Thank you.
Autonomous driving.
Yeah.
How does all this dovetail with autonomous driving?
That's a conversation over a beer afterwards.